So I've gotten questions from a lot of beginners that say, okay, I know how to use perspective pretty much, but how do I use it for characters? How do I use it for creature designs? And the answer is, well, the same rules. But this really points out the way people feel about perspective, which is it works for rigid stuff, but it doesn't work for soft stuff. Well, that's just not true. So what we're going to do here is think from simple to complex. So if you can think about the basic geometric understructure of an object, all the rest is just detailing it out. So in this way, you could reduce these complicated characters into simple mannequins, basic shapes that you can use to approximate your character. Because these are easier to visualize in 3D space, just like drawing a cube is easier than it is to draw a dinosaur. So to keep things simple for this first example, we're going to work from reference. Because if you don't want to have to worry about too many things at once, it can be great to practice these skills drawing an actual object from reference material. So for this T-Rex, I'm going to start by drawing sort of a bounding box that his skull is going to fit inside of. You could also do this with a full grid if you wanted, but I'm just going to start with the basic bounding cube. And now I need to get to that basic form that I like to call the shell. So here I'm going to draw the basic shape of the jaw. And you'll notice I'm including a center line here. This helps me visualize the shape symmetrically. And I just put in a simple sphere for the skull, and I'm going to dot in some eyeballs and brow ridges. But this is basically it. This is a sort of cartoon, simplistic version of the dinosaur, but all the basics are here. This, as I envision it, is my shell. Now, of course, just like before, I'm not going to actually draw this on the page. I don't need to render out the shell. This is simply what I envision as I'm working up my drawing. But I've got the reference to work from here, so I don't need to do too much more structure at this point. The fact that I'm envisioning the shell while I begin to add these details means that it's all going to pretty much fall into place. I'm adding in the teeth that I look at in the photo reference, but all the time I'm wrapping it around this mannequin form. I'm thinking of that shell. It's always going to guide where my lines should go. And just like we talked about in the previous videos, the more lines I get into this drawing, the easier it is to proceed. There's so much of these major forms that are wrapping around this shell that I can pretty confidently lay in more and more details. Because right now I'm really just wrapping it around the mannequin. In my mind, I feel the 3D shape. And the rest is just detail and polish. And since I'm working digitally, it's really easy to then go ahead and remove that grid. I can sort of erase away the understructure, and now I just have the pencil lines. And here I can detail as much as I want, but you can see that I really benefited from that early structural underpinning. It makes these details be much more confident. I don't have to do a lot of erasing and fixing the perspective as I go, because I made sure the perspective was right to begin with. And when most people think about drawing creatures and characters, this detail phase, I think, is what people really enjoy. This is what they want to jump to right away. But as you can see, having waited a little while, made sure my structure was right first, this phase is much more convincing. So what if I wanted to envision a sci-fi monster that had no reference? This may be sort of generally like a lizard, but really this is not a real creature. So how would I approach doing a concept art design even though I can't actually look at reference? Well, the answer, the same way. I think first of the shell, the sort of mannequin form that I want to wrap this sci-fi creature around. And even if you don't render it out this way, it's definitely what you're thinking about. So here's realistically what I might start with: a sphere and a couple center lines. And then I can begin to add structure to this, thinking in terms of 3D. And you might notice that I put the horizon line in the center of this image. His top jaw is above the horizon, so I can see the underside of his palate and lots of teeth, and the bottom jaw is below the horizon line, so I can see all the teeth. This was a conscious choice, and it really allows me to focus on the exciting part of this character. Now you can see here I haven't put in any specific details yet. Especially since I'm not working from reference, I'm imagining this character, I have to be really careful about getting accidentally out of perspective. So to avoid that, I spend longer working in this sort of block form, basic shape look. And I'm going to refine it a bit more, and eventually once I'm happy with it, then I'll start adding all my details. But not having that reference to work from means that I have to be more careful about the structure. So if I want to add teeth, I shouldn't just add a triangle like you see on the left. Teeth are cylinders. So just like the simple cylinders we drew in previous videos, that's how you should draw every tooth. It's got to have roundness. And so once you have your form and it's ready to add teeth, well, think of the footprint of each tooth. Draw that cylinder right there onto his jaw, and then extend a tooth straight out of it. It's exactly the same as drawing the footprint of a building and extending it straight vertically. So now I'm to the fun part of the image. I have my sort of imaginary version of the shell. I'm really picturing it carefully in 3D space, and now I begin to wrap details around it. Because I don't want this to look flat. There's a danger that characters end up looking too flat if they don't have a realistic sense of 3D structure. Now, once again, I envision the shell and I wrap the superficial details around it. All the cool stuff, the wrinkles of the skin, the pores, and the little tiny bumps and horns. All that stuff is really just dressing on top of the basic form and structure. And the rest is just polish. Okay, so what about a human? This is something that people have trouble drawing. But perspective rules work exactly the same for a character as they do for a building. So here I've got a side view of sort of a knight character. And to begin drawing him in perspective, I could put down a full 3D grid. But this time I haven't. All I've done are some converging lines going towards a vanishing point. And what these lines are going to do are line up his primary dividing lines. So the waist, the shoulders, the feet, the top of the head, all of these sit on sort of parallel lines. And just like in previous examples, I'm going to start with that center line, sort of the spine in this case. Then I just draw in some legs and head and rough out the sort of underlying structure. This structure is no different than roughing out for basic objects like we have in previous videos. The only difference is this is a person. And as you've established more and more of your structure, you can begin to add in those details. And here you'd probably look at some costume reference and really figure out what armor looks like. But that underpinning, that general structure that the perspective helped us with, that really sells this image. The rest of it is just detailing, and you're probably good at detailing. But it was those initial perspective lines that really gave us the foundation we needed to make this character believably sit in space. Well, maybe you want to do 2 characters, or a whole scene full of characters. In a situation like this, I usually like to start with a foundation object. So here I'm actually going to start with a table and have my other characters interacting with the table. And a table is good because it's pretty much just a box. And once I've got this in space with a few perspective lines around, I have a good starting point. Now I can begin to sketch in my characters and make sure that their feet line up with the ground. And his hands in this case are right on the table. So he's sort of anchored in this 3D space. The next character, he's sitting on a chair, which is pretty much a box. But now I've got most of the scene arranged in proper perspective. So now adding details is, well, just adding details. Once again, this whole thing was made possible by that underlying structure. And I could have started with a full 3D grid, but as you get more and more comfortable with perspective, you don't really need to do that. But being able to envision this 3D space made it much easier to put 2 characters into it. Now, it may not seem like it, but something as simple as a portrait follows the rules of perspective as well. Because I can think of the underlying form. In this case, sort of a head can be simplified down to a sphere with a cube coming out of the bottom. And I'm not going to talk too much about the specifics of the anatomy of the head because it's out of the scope of this video, but the same idea applies. Here we have the shell. And it might sound like old hat by now, but once I've got the shell, the rest of it has a much better chance of falling into place. So here I'm focusing on the center line, just like I did with that back of the rocket ship. Once I can get the center line, getting the rest in perspective, wrapping it around that shell is much easier. And of course, being able to do this successfully is going to require a lot of practice. People are just hard to draw. But you can see I'm thinking in terms of form. I'm not just drawing the outline of a person's face. I'm envisioning the structure and then wrapping details on top of it. Exactly the same as I would do for an object or an environment, a person's face is no different. And I could detail this as long as I want, and eventually I'll come up with sort of a finished drawing. And working in digital makes it much easier to erase away that understructure, and all I'm left with is the nice final lines. Now I hope in all of this you're beginning to see a pattern. Working from simple to complex will allow you to draw anything. Being able to visualize and successfully draw a cube or a basic shape in 3D space is it. Once you've got the shell, the rest is really just polish. So if you're having trouble drawing complicated objects, think about reducing them down to a basic shell. That's a great starting point.